Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this beast is the Nvidia Titan V, launching for $3,000 back in late 2017. This wasn't really targeted toward gaming, more for those who needed high compute performance for machine learning, stuff like that. That said, I'm sure there were certainly some gamers out there who took one look at the $700 GTX 1080 Ti and thought, nah, I'm going to need something even better. And it was. Despite not being promoted as a gaming card, it still received game-ready drivers at launch, and its huge 5,120 CUDA core count, along with 12 gigs of HBM2 memory, meant that it beat Nvidia's top-tier Ti offering. One review I found said that for the additional $2,000 plus, you'd get about 18 to 20% higher frame rates. Oh, and did I mention that it's gold? It looks amazing. Yeah, if I was rich, I definitely would have bought this. I'm very easily pleased. It's gold, and therefore I want it. I love this old style reference cooler too. I don't think any board partners released their own versions of the Titan V because of the whole not a gaming GPU thing. Today, however, we are going to be seeing if this is still a gaming beast. Now, I paid about £200 here in the UK, so this is way more affordable 8 years on. Unfortunately, it lost game-ready driver support along with the 10 series cards in very late 2025, though this isn't a big deal right now. So I've tested a handful of my favourite games at 1080p and 1440p, targeting at least 60 frames per second and using only native resolution, unless of course 60 frames per second wasn't possible. First things first, and hardware ray tracing is a no-no. There are no dedicated RT cores. We'll have to see how it handles software-based ray tracing in supported games another time. Ignore my CPU temps in the following gameplay tests. I was using a cheap air cooler on an i9, but surprisingly it didn't throttle. Speaking of temperatures, and like with the reference 1080 Ti graphics card, this will hit about 83 degrees by design, as you'll see throughout. It's not a problem, this is basically expected, but those clock speeds will drop and vary depending on the title. So in no particular order then, we are starting off with Oblivion Remastered here. This, I think, is probably the most intensive game that we tested today. At first I tested it, I was like, yeah, we're getting well over 60 FPS, like 70 something. And then I realised that the render scale was set to like 50% resolution. It was only when I turned it up to 100% res that we saw a huge dip in performance, and that meant instead of the medium preset that I started off using, I had to use the low preset instead. I did, however, switch the textures to high as well as the reflections, otherwise the water looks pretty bad. And with these settings, along with TSR enabled, with of course 100% scaling, we saw 63 FPS with a 1% low of 45 and a 0.1% low of 25, so the usual dips and drops that we get in Oblivion Remastered with basically every other piece of hardware that I test. Now if we want to play Oblivion at 1440p on the Titan V in early 2026, that feels very weird to say, then we can stick with the low preset, of course, we can't go any lower. We can also use the high textures and reflections as before, but this time we need a bit of help from FSR upscaling. This is the only title whereby I used FSR, because it's necessary for at least 60 FPS here, but with these options enabled we saw 70 frames per second with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 24, so the same dips and drops here and there, but overall not bad at all. And if you're happy with less than 60 FPS, then you're going to be absolutely fine, and you can probably push the settings up a bit. I then moved on to Arc Raiders. First of all, we have 1080p with the high preset, TSR once again, for 85 frames per second. We could have potentially turned things up a bit more, and I did so to start with, but we will see less than 60 FPS, or at least dips and drops below this, and I really wanted to try and maintain at least 60 frames per second today to show this beast of a card the respect it deserves, I think. So 85 FPS overall, with a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 65. Really smooth and consistent today, not a problem in Arc Raiders. The Titan V is powering through here. When we switch to 1440p, I dropped things to the medium preset in order to retain at least 60 FPS. We saw 72 as an average, a 1% low of 62, and a 0.1% low of 44. Now this did drop a little bit, but it was only when moving between certain areas. There was like a brief spike in the performance graph. I'm not sure if I captured it here or not, so you may pick it up, but this was the only instance whereby we saw a significant dip in performance, so really not a big deal. Of course, we have that 12 gigs of high bandwidth memory as well, which is certainly helping us out, especially when it comes to texture settings. Next up we have Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced, starting off at 1080p once again with the absolute highest settings. I literally turned everything up as high as it would go here. We can't make use of the RT options in this one. We do lack hardware-based ray tracing. Some games will let us enable it anyway. I think Cyberpunk comes to mind. Even if you've got like a 1080 Ti or one of these, it's going to do it on a software level. I think Battlefield 5 as well was one of the first games to offer this. Anyway, with GTA 5 Enhanced with the highest settings, I actually turned FSR 3 on here and set it to native AA because it looks so much better than TAA. TAA looks blurry even when you've got the sharpness slider turned way up, but FSR 3, while it will compromise the frame rates a little bit, you will see a significant drop in performance. It didn't really matter because we were getting well over 100 anyway. 129 was the average, with lows of 95 and 61. Switching to 1440p, and we can basically keep the settings exactly the same. Highest settings with FSR3 native and anti-aliasing for 96 FPS. This actually felt a little smoother, although the overall frame rate was lower. Any dips and drops didn't feel as significant here, and this is reflective in the percentile lows of 76 and 55, so a great experience here, and you could probably even push this to 4K and maintain this level of detail with the Titan V. Next up we have Battlefield 6. Now this was a little bit problematic. I am using the latest supported drivers, or basically the last set of drivers, or the last game ready drivers for this card, which is 581.80. Let me just double check that really quickly to make sure we are actually using the latest. Yeah, 581.80 released in October or late October 2025. Unfortunately, the last game ready driver for this, as well as 10 series cards. 900 and 700 series cards as well lost support too. Now I didn't have the high-res textures enabled here. We could do, this was perfectly fine, but I'd probably recommend leaving them uninstalled if you're using a card with less than 16 gigs of RAM. I don't think it makes much of a difference visually, to be honest, unless you're looking at textures up close, which you don't really have time to do in a fast-paced online shooter like this. With the Ultra preset at 1080p, then with the high-res textures not installed, we were getting 94 frames per second, a 1% low of 76, and a 0.1% low of 53. The thing is, intermittently, I'd get a driver crash and then a warning to update the drivers, which of course we can't do. So I'm not sure if perhaps another clean installation would fix this next time around. It didn't happen very often. It was like once every few games the driver would just crash and then the game would close. Obviously not ideal. Performance though, really good. When we switched to 1440p, I dropped from the Ultra preset to the Medium preset to maintain at least 60 FPS. Again, no high-res textures here. We were seeing 78, so still plus 60. The 1% low was 56, and the 0.1% low was 41. Again, we couldn't escape the occasional driver crash with this one. So we'll try another clean install before we start to compare this to other GPUs in another video and see if we can sort this out. Perhaps reverting to a slightly older version of the driver may fix it. I've fixed driver problems like that before. Counter-Strike 2 obviously poses no issues for this card with the very high preset and 8x MSAA enabled at 1080p. We're getting 292 frames per second here, a 1% low of 187 and a 0.1% low of 64. Moving on to 1440p for this one, exactly the same settings with 8x MSAA, and we got 192 FPS on average. The 1% low was 148 and the 0.1% low was 102. So again, really smooth and consistent, not a problem here, and we could certainly push this to 4K and perhaps beyond if it's supported in Counter-Strike 2. One of my favourite games of the past year now, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Now, performance will vary depending on where you are. If you're running around towns causing chaos and carnage, then you may see a slightly higher frame rate than if you're exploring the forests and woodland. Here though, at 1080p with high and SMAA 2TX, the average was 98 frames per second despite the occasional dips and drops. The 1% low was 79 and the 0.1% low was 77, so really smooth. Couldn't ask for more from this card and this game, to be honest, especially with these settings. Now, interestingly, when I pushed things to Ultra, which I initially played around with, we did get dips and drops almost immediately below 60 FPS, so high is definitely a better bet, and there's not too much of a visual difference. We can push things all the way up to experimental, which goes beyond Ultra settings, and still retain at least 30 FPS, so if you're happy with around, 30, 40 FPS and beyond, then it's going to be fine, but don't expect 60 from this card with the higher detail options here. At 1440p, to hit 60 plus frames per second, all it takes is a drop to the medium preset, again with SMAA 2TX enabled. This time we were seeing 83 frames per second, a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 68. So again, it's a really smooth experience here, in part thanks to, well, the absolute beast of a Titan V. I keep wanting to say Titan 5. I'm so used to seeing GTA V, like GTA 5, that I want to say Titan 5 as well, but I do not think that's correct. I think that's just because of the Volta GPU architecture, unless it's also the 5th Titan in the series, which would be interesting, whether coincidental or not. But anyway, 1440p at medium here, plus 60 FPS, very easy in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, a very well optimised game in my experience. Cyberpunk 2077 also surprised me. At 1080p we could push the preset to Ultra. This also involved setting the textures and crowd density to high. We saw 91 frames per second overall. I was expecting performance to drop a little bit in and around those busier areas, but it seemed to hold pretty firm. 64 was that 1% low and the 0.1% low was 39, so it wasn't completely flawless, but overall the experience was a lot better than I was anticipating. The same can be said for 1440p. Instead of Ultra, I went with the high preset instead. We kept the textures and crowd set to high too, and in return we saw 70 frames per second this time around, with a 1% low of 56 and a 0.1% low of 33. I think perhaps medium settings would be a better bet, just to sit a bit more comfortably above 60 frames per second and avoid some of those drops into the mid-50s, but for the most part, high is going to be absolutely fine on this beast of a GPU from at least 8 years ago. Our second to last game now, Red Dead Redemption 2, with the ultra textures, everything else set to high or on, and our TAA high gave us 85 FPS. Again, just like in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, performance will differ depending on where you are. I found that the town of Valentine, for example, performs better than the surrounding woodlands. Like if you venture off into the long grass and trees, then performance will dip a little bit, but it's still maintained at least 60 frames per second, 85 FPS overall, a 1% low of 65 and a 0.1% low of 40. There were a couple of little hiccups here and there. Switching to 1440p now, and once again we have the ultra textures, though this time everything else was set to medium instead of high, but I left all the options on. Geometry and grass level of detail sliders were also maxed out, and TAA was set to medium this time around for 81 frames per second. So almost the same performance as before, only with lower graphical options. And there was one little hiccup as I ventured between Valentine to the woods, and this meant that our 0.1% low came back at 14, but this isn't really reflective of the entire gameplay experience, but I thought I'd keep it in here anyway, just to show you that there was a little bit of a hiccup during this gameplay benchmark test. To finalise then, we have Baldur's Gate 3. This has no problems at 1080p or 1440p with the Ultra preset. I'm using Ultra at 1080p first of all, with TAA for 134 frames per second. The 1% low was 86 and the 0.1% low was 60. I've always said that this one I don't think really needs 60 frames per second to be enjoyable, but it is always a bonus, of course, and with 1440p we're getting 93 frames per second and a 1% figure that still sticks to at least 60 FPS too. A very nice 69 was that 1% low. Our 0.1% figure was 53. As we can see here, throughout the GPU has been consuming up to 250 watts of power as well. So you're certainly going to get better power efficiency from newer and equally as capable options. To conclude then, the Titan 5, I keep wanting to say it, the Titan V is still an absolute beast despite its lack of ray tracing and, to be honest, the fact that there may be newer, less expensive but equally as capable options out there could be enough to dissuade you from purchasing one. If you do find one of these for around £200, $200, I don't think it's a bad choice at all. But then again, if you can get a 1080 Ti for cheaper than that, that may be worth it if you don't care about ray tracing, or perhaps you can get an RTX 20 series card as well. We'll have to run a few comparisons to see whereabouts this sits in 2026 in comparison to some of the closely priced used options, but when focusing on the card on its own, it can still pump out some pretty respectable figures, that's for sure. But let me know what you think down below. Have you ever owned one of these? Did you buy one new for $3,000? Leave all of your thoughts and comments in the comments section, of course. Thank you very much for watching. Leave a like on this one if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And hopefully I'll see all of you next time.